Hi, thanks for joining us. I'm Rosie Warren. I'm the editor-in-chief of Salvage, which is co-sponsoring this event. For those of you who don't know, Salvage is a print publication. We publish approximately twice a year, though not always. We are attempting to create a space for those of us who remain committed to collective liberation, even while acknowledging that catastrophe is very much already upon us. And that catastrophe has perhaps never been more clear. After more than a year of their genocidal campaign in Gaza, Israel's assassination of Hassan Nasrallah and subsequent invasion of Southern Lebanon leaves the region poised on the brink of regional war. While mainstream outlets and politicians fell over themselves to blare the loudest denunciations of Israel's retaliatory missile barrage launched in response, solidarity activists the world over are scrambling to understand how we got here, what we can do to force our rulers back from the abyss. So I'm really glad to be joined today by Joseph Daha, who is the author of Marxism and Palestine, Syria After the Uprisings, and Hezbollah, the Political Economy of Lebanon's Party of God, as well as a piece in the forthcoming issue of Salvage about Hamas. And who'll be in conversation with Sai Englert, the author of Settler Colonialism, an Introduction, and co-author of a piece in the last issue of Salvage about Palestine, which you can now read online. Thanks both of you for joining for us to talk to us tonight, and also to John at Haymarket for making this event possible. It's mysteriously in the background. So to kick us off, I wanted to just start off, let's start with you, Joe. How would you characterize the current moment? What's going on in the region?
First of all, thank you for the organization of such an event. I think it's particularly important. We are now more than a year after the beginning of the genocidal war against the Palestinians that has been ongoing, and the latest image and video that we can see from Jabalia camp, or the assassination of Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas political bureau, shows that unfortunately we are ongoing in this genocidal war, notwithstanding that the annexation of the West Bank is also ongoing. It's been the highest level of land grabbing from the past decade since the 7th of October. There are more than 10,000 political prisoners. The violence of the settlers assisted with the Israeli occupation army is also completely ongoing. So this is first to say that in a year, unfortunately, the genocidal war has continued. And then it has not stopped there. We are now in a regional war, in my perspective, as the war has extended since mid-September to Lebanon, first by the terrible kind of terror attack of the Pagers attack that killed more than 40 people but injured thousands of civilians, and also after an extension of bombing that are in many ways even worse, according to certain estimates and analysis, than the 2006 war, the Israeli war on Lebanon. And is also, now we are witnessing in the past few weeks, ground invasion of Israeli occupation army trying to reoccupy territories in south of Lebanon, with images that also remind us of what is going on in the Gaza Strip. Moreover, Israel is threatening the whole region through attacks, not only, as we said, in Palestine or in Lebanon, but threats of a future attack on Iran, has been also targeting Yemen, Syria as well, not only pro-Iranian or pro-Hezbollah target, but also has assassinated civilians in civilian urban areas in Damascus, for example, through the targeting of particular Hezbollah personalities. So what we can say is that we're witnessing a total impunity of Israel, and that this impunity is allowed, and not only allowed by a silence, I would say complicity by the main Western powers and at its head, the USA, but the direct collaboration. The US has provided since the 7th of October more than 18 billion US dollars to the Israeli occupation army. And if a state is really serious about reaching a ceasefire, as it's been continuously put forward since the 7th of October by US. You can see different headlines of main newspapers saying US is putting red line. US is saying to the Israeli occupation army, don't exceed these red lines. This is total hypocrisy. This is maybe the most hypocrite US administration in history. Biden has also said that none other administration has helped as much as his administration, Israel. So finally, after a year, it's very hard to find a bit of optimism, but we'll come back to this later, maybe on the international solidarity movement, the radicalization, the Palestinian issue. But more generally, and this will be, I will conclude on this, I think after a year and at what moment we are, I believe that the genocidal war, the extension of the war to the region, extension of killing, destruction, is a reflection also of the deep political crisis we're living on an international level, with two political projects dominating, unfortunately, our political scene, the neoliberal authoritarian model and the fascist one, in which there's a need for an alternative, leftist project that has difficulties to emerge. But I think through the Palestinian cause, that is not only an international issue, but is being also, being a key issue in our societies in the West, is also today restructuring the left, is in some sort one of the only, kind of hope when we see mass movement. So, yes, I conclude on this. It's a reflection of a deep political crisis we're living and of great threats, I believe, for all of us.
Sai, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much, Joe, and thanks so much, Rosie and Haymarket and Salvage for organizing this event, for inviting me to. It's a real honor to be able to be in discussion with both of you today. I have to give my apologies. I'm ill. I've been teaching today, and so my voice is in whatever this is. So if I start eating something, it's because I have a pile of Strepsils next to me to get me through the next 2 hours. I think I agree with everything that Joe just said. I have no disagreements. I guess to add that I think what we're seeing is an attempt by American imperialism in alliance with Israel, and I think it's important to really see it that way. I know we'll have the opportunity to talk about the nature of that relationship more, but to fundamentally redraw the status quo in the region. And I think that status quo is being redrawn in two directions. I think on the one hand, we're seeing a fundamental redrawing of the status quo in terms of the relationship between Israel and the Palestinians. And I think that's sort of been on the table for quite a while. I think on the one hand, there's been real debates within Israeli society about how useful the kind of Oslo framework still is, which is that on the one hand, Israeli politicians have for a long time declared it dead, and it's kind of one of the many extraordinary hypocrisies in which our leaders continue to talk about the Oslo Agreement while Israeli politicians for 20 years have been saying it's dead and that they're not obeying by its framework. But I think there's been a question for a long time. The framework continued to serve as enough of a pacifying force within Palestinian society to maintain it, all the while continuing the colonial expansion of the Israeli state. And it seems to me that the kind of political alliance that Netanyahu has drawn around him, and that really has been the sort of the dominant bloc in Israeli politics since the late 70s, early 80s, has increasingly come to the conclusion that that status quo was getting in the way. And so people might remember the big demonstrations in Israel that started almost 2 years ago now, that were often framed incorrectly in the West as sort of progressive or left-wing demonstrations, but they were a fight over the nature of the state. And one of the big questions was what to do with Oslo and the Palestinians, and the Israeli right argued that it was time to abandon the differences, the legal differences that Israel maintained in its rule over Palestinians in 48 and in 67, and to impose one unified form of Israeli control over the whole of historic Palestine, excluding Gaza at the time. But so I think partly what's happening now, the genocide, the unspeakable level of destruction, murder, violence that we are seeing. I mean, now the shutting down of Jabalia in the north, and what appears to be, from the reports that we are receiving, the kind of house by house massacring, with real kind of discussions of depopulation and the potential settling of part of Gaza, I think points further in that direction, a fundamental redrawing of what the status quo is between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and an extremely aggressive push, as we've seen at different times in Israeli history. And I think it's important to remember that that's how the Israeli settler colonial project has always operated, which is to slowly amass more land and more power through prolonged periods, and then at key moments of historical opportunity, quote unquote, to majorly push forward. And that's what we saw certainly in 48 and in 67. It was partly the hope, perhaps, in Lebanon in the 1980s, although a defeated one in the end. And I think we are in such a moment that Israel is seeing an opportunity to fundamentally redraw the parameters of what's considered normal in the future. And I think that's why they are pushing as hard as they can, certainly in Gaza, but as Joe said, also in the West Bank. The second part, I think, is an attempt to redraw the regional balance of power. And I think that's what we're seeing in Lebanon now, and potentially in Iran. I mean, the news is that the Israeli government has now agreed what the nature of the response will be. That's what the Israeli press is saying. I think we'll see. One of the things I learned, I think, over the last year is to stop trying to predict things. It turns out I'm not good at it, but one way or another, I think that's the kind of, and so that's perhaps also worth thinking what victory looks like, because I think people are rightly pointing out that it seems extremely unlikely that Israel would be able to hold either the whole of the Gaza Strip or the south of Lebanon. The tenacity and the extraordinary ability of the resistance to continue to fight on in unspeakable consequences a year later, and clearly the major military difficulties that Israel is experiencing in the south of Lebanon, I think, point to real limitations or real difference between fantasy and reality, let's say, in sort of colonial policy, in terms of how far they will be able to establish control. But what I think is undeniable is that this is seen as an opportunity for a sort of a regional mowing the grass operation, to use the Israeli language that they use and have used in Gaza for the last 20 years or 18 years, the kind of regular military operations that are primarily targeted at destroying military capability and civilian infrastructure in Gaza, but I think now also in South Lebanon, or in Lebanon, actually. We're well beyond the south at this point. And potentially tomorrow in Iran as well. And in that sense, I think it's really important to keep hammering the fact that it is not only Israel's genocide or Israel's project, it's very much that of the United States that continues to arm it. I mean, we now know it's, 18 billion in direct and indirect support to Israel has been sent over the last year. Today, a German military ship participated in shooting down a Hezbollah drone in Lebanon. The British have been present with intelligence and support staff, as have the Dutch. I'm speaking to you from the Netherlands. There's been direct intervention in Yemen by both Britain, the Netherlands, and the United States. And so very much, I think, a collective Western project of very aggressively and clearly for as long as possible. I think the length of time of this process is one of the things that's difficult to sort of really deal with, but clearly to push as long as possible and as hard as possible fundamentally redraw the balance of power in the region in a way that will sort of define the period to come.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on something you said. I guess I was a little surprised to hear you using the language of mowing the lawn, given that in the past, what has been referred to as that have been these much shorter, equally brutal, but much shorter bombardments of Gaza that were clearly in the knowledge that they were kind of maintaining a certain level of combat. And what seems to be happening now is not only on a different scale in terms of timeline, but also, its declared aim seems to be something much deeper. Would you say that that's right?
Yeah, definitely. So just to be clear, I think in Gaza, we are well beyond a mowing the law operation, right? We are in the middle of a genocide, mass displacement, and I think it's not impossible to imagine that we will see attempts at establishing settlements in Gaza, again, certainly in the north. Whether that's actually possible or not, again, I think we should make a difference between the fantasies of the colonizer and what they're actually able to establish on the ground. But so I think that's one thing. I think on a regional level, I struggle to believe that Israel generally thinks that it could defeat Hezbollah or Iran or the Houthis in Yemen, barring an all-out military intervention that would involve the United States and potentially other Western allies on a scale sort of, boots on the ground, etc., which seems to me to be outside of what is possible. I might be wrong, but it is my assumption. I don't think Israel believes they can defeat Hezbollah, let alone Iran. What I think they do think they can do is to use the opportunity to try to destroy as much of its military capacity, infrastructure, and what it thinks will be its ability to destroy its popular support in its strongholds by collectively punishing the entire population of Lebanon. And it seems to me that that's the regional aim, is to try to inflict as much damage and disorganization as possible. And so the kind of the assassination campaigns, the pager, I don't know what to call it. I don't know if massacre is the right word, but the kind of indiscriminate explosion of pages across Lebanon, etc. I think empires sometimes believe their own propaganda. So maybe the Americans and the Israelis think they could go further. I doubt it. I don't think they believe that they can defeat either or destroy either Hezbollah or Iran. But I think they see it as a regional mowing the law operation, destroy as much as possible, disorganize as much as possible, weaken as much as possible in order to kind of reorganize the balance of power for however long the period ahead is.
Yeah, Joe, do you want to add anything to that in terms of the kind of end game in Lebanon and what they're obviously we've seen in the last couple of days a slightly different rhetoric from the US and this deadline where they're suddenly threatening to withdraw military aid, which I don't see any reason to believe that this time, but it does seem to be a slightly stronger threat than they've been making previously. Like, what do you make of that? What do we think the US wants out of this war with Lebanon and the escalation with Iran?
Yeah, so I think what we've been trying to describe is clearly a deep willingness by the Israelis, supported by the US, and the US is the key actor once again. And we have to be clear here to change the balance of forces. Actually, Netanyahu has used terminologies that bring us back to the Bush era, Bush son, saying we're building a new Middle East, or we're looking towards a new Middle East, clearly wanting to basically undermine as much as possible, if not destroy, and I agree with Sai, I think this will be difficult, but undermine as much as possible, politically, militarily, what is called the pro-Iranian network. And in this perspective, weakening and undermining the crown jewel of this Iranian, network or connected network is Hezbollah. Hezbollah has been playing an increasing role within this network of influence of Iran. For example, it was Hezbollah that played an intermediary role to this kind of cold rapprochement between the Syrian regime and Hamas 2 years ago, or playing an intermediary role between various Shia pro-Iranian Iraqi factions in Iran, while it sent as well, cadres to the Houthis in the past few years to improve their military capacities. And clearly there's a willingness by the US to push forward this. While, again, I'll be careful regarding the various statements of the US. I think what is clear from the US side is rather what kind of target Israel will have in Iran. And they have a particular interest, because Biden did not prevent any future potential attack of Israel on Iran, but said it would be a problem for us if you target oil production centers, etc., because of its own interest, of the economic consequences that would occur on the US economy, inflation, and on the elections. So this is why maybe they are putting this kind of statements now, but I hardly believe that there's any kind of red lines to be believed by the US. Again, I believe that if Israel has been acting this way, it's because it had the total support of the US. For example, a few months ago, we would hear, the US doesn't want an expansion of the war in Lebanon. As soon as Israel, expanded its war campaign of assassination from key military and political cadres of Hezbollah, Biden just celebrated it. So really, I think we have to be careful with these kind of statements. They're really a willingness to change the balance of forces. And also, Israel was able to push with the support of the US, also because of the problem in the strategy of Iran and Hezbollah. Basically, if you want to play a deterrent role, you need to show that you're ready for a total war. And actually, Iran and Hezbollah have been claiming since the beginning of 7th October that they don't want an open war. And even Hezbollah, I think, has taken too much in confidence the words of the US. There were intermediary talks. We will respect the rule of engagement on our side. Beirut will not be hit. Beirut was hit from January, a second time in the summer. And Israel just expanded, the war afterwards. So again, there's a clear, I think, opportunity seen on the US and Israeli side to change drastically the balance of forces, and also to try to dismantle to a certain extent the pro-Iranian network of influence, to break some forms of coordination, because we cannot deny that the discourse or the political discourse of the unity of front has not been very effective, actually, from Hezbollah or Iran. Actually, the genocide has been ongoing, and on Hezbollah's side, destruction have increased Lebanon. And if we see a major difference than in 2006, not one single high military political cadres of Hezbollah had been assassinated. And you see today with the vast difference. So again, I think we have to be careful with these kind of statements. Unfortunately, it's hard to believe them. And yes, unfortunately, I think we're not seeing an end to it. And I think it's the beginning of a new war campaign that will last for more than several weeks, maybe more months.
Yeah, I want to pick up on something that I think we've touched on a couple of times, which is obviously what's been going on publicly and what the US have been saying publicly and what Israel have been saying publicly has made it look as if the US is trying to stop something from happening and then Israel keeps disobeying, right? And in some ways that seems convincing. You know, they keep seeming like they're on the back foot. They've made a statement, immediately Israel undermines them. The diplomats seem to be scrambling. They've put out a statement. It's clearly not adding up. You know, there are a couple of ways you could think about this. One is that they're utterly inept and it's complete incompetence, and that they're not, you know, the left hand isn't speaking to the right hand, and maybe they're saying one thing in one room, but somebody else is making the call in a different room. And the other is that they're just lying and that this is all a performance. And I tend to think that it's a performance, and that there's, you know, that they're not as inept as they would have us believe. But I wonder if it's worth us talking about, like, who is the audience for that when they're making these kind of performance? Who is it that they're kind of making these distortions for? Why not just be honest that this is in the US's interest?
I mean, if I can maybe start us off. So first of all, I actually think we have to be extremely clear that they are absolutely lying. Like, I don't actually think we can entertain the idea that maybe something else is going on. If the United States wanted this to end, it would be finished tomorrow. The only reason that economically or militarily Israel is able to continue to pound certainly the Palestinians in Gaza and now the Lebanese population in the sort of extraordinarily horrendous kind of ways that we've seen is because the United States make it possible. So, you know, I was mentioning the 18 billion in direct and indirect aid over a year. It's an American genocide, and it's an American campaign. And of course, that's the historic role of Israel. That was the whole point, to have a military base in the region that could maintain imperial power without the United States having to do it directly. And that's exactly what's happening. On the 7th of October, 2023, Hamas didn't only attack Israel, it also endangered the kind of the normalization strategies that the United States has been the central architect of across the region for you know, a very long time, and certainly over the last kind of decade and a half in an accelerated way. And so empires punish those who step out of way. And, you know, I think anybody that spent some time looking at the history of colonization and of imperialism knows that the kind of extraordinary amount of violence that is expounded to teach a lesson, not only to those who fight back, but to anybody else that might have in their minds the idea of doing that too. And there's a great article written by Nihal El-Assar that's doing the rounds for the moment, that also talks about what the consequences of the genocide are on the Arab masses, right? That the Arab leaders are able to mobilize it today to say, you want to fight back, look at what happens if you do, right? And I think really that's so that's the first audience, I think, is that there is a global audience that the empire is saying to, particularly in a situation of being much more challenged and pushed back by, principally the growing influence of China, that in a situation of challenge, this is how resistance will be punished. And so both Israel and the United States, both locally and globally or regionally, have an interest in doing that. So I think that's the first audience. The second thing is that our governments, both in North America and in Europe, are doing so in a situation of major resistance from their own populations. We have seen, I think, the largest social movements in solidarity with the Palestinians ever. Industrial action, demonstrations, direct action, shutting down of arms factories, port workers refusing to unload cargo, massive advances in terms of the divestment, the boycott, divestment and sanctions campaign, major pushback. In fact, even small and peripheral, but nonetheless important fractures inside of the European strategy towards towards Israel, and so places like Belgium, Spain, certainly Ireland, some of the Scandinavian countries, allowing greater amount of pressure in their institutions, weapons policies, etc., towards Israel. And so I think in that situation of the United States and the West carrying out via Israel an extraordinary amount of violence and destruction in the region, a genocide in Gaza, an invasion in Lebanon, perhaps tomorrow an assault on Iran, some level of performative deniability, I think, is still necessary. And nowhere is that more the case in the United States, where it is very imaginable that the Democrats will lose the upcoming election on the basis of their continued and unwavering arming and supporting of both the genocide and the assault on Lebanon. So I think, but I do think we have to be extremely clear about this. This is American policy. We now know, for example, that close advisors to Biden told Netanyahu when he was in New York to address the UN, and the day that he ordered the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah and the pounding of Dahye inside of the building of the UN, that on that same visit, the direct advisors to Biden told him the United States would support an assault on Lebanon, right? So like we can keep sort of the kind of Kremlinology alive of who meant what, etc. But I think totally at the detriment of analytical clarity. Yeah, so sorry, that was perhaps too long.
Mm-hmm. May I, Rosie? Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Joe.
No, I totally agree on the first point of Sai. It's also a message sent by U.S. imperialism, which has witnessed a form of relative weakening since the beginning of the 2000s, especially after the defeat of the U.S. occupation of Iraq, the financial crisis, the revolutionary processes of the 2011-12. You had, growing international powers such as China, Russia, also consolidating their power, more intervening, as well, more autonomy among regional powers. So definitely what we witness since a year is a message sent to anyone, any political actor, that any form of resistance will be crushed in a very, very violent way. And we have kind of allies such as Israel to implement such actions. And without forgetting that the key issue of the normalization between Israel and the Gulf regime has been the consolidation of U.S. influence in the region, especially facing rising power of China on the other side. So this is clear. A second element, but this doesn't, because there's a consensus, as it has been explained, between Republicans and Democrats to support Israel. And the U.S. election has demonstrated this. The debates between Kamala Harris and Trump, who is the best candidate to help and who is doing more, etc. But I think something to take into consideration on the latest point of Sai is that there's a difference in the popular base of the Republicans and the Democrats. Sections of the Democrat on the left and non-white population, especially Arabs, have been mobilizing around the issue of Palestine. And now they're threatening more and more to not vote even for Harris, because every election it's the same kind of game. We don't want the most evilistic, but today for a lot of people coming from Arab background, or for really principled leftists, there's less and less difference on many aspects between Trump and Kamala Harris. But the Democrats have to deal with this kind of popular basis. So this is why I think they're making these kind of statements that, as we were explaining, is complete lies, but try to to make kind of these lies at least true for certain sections of the popular base of the Democrats that are still mobilizing around Palestine. So this, I think, is a major difference than, for example, the Republican Party and especially Trump, where you have a big chunk of Christian fundamentalists, where they see the support of Israel in religious terms also, and in a very anti-Semitic ways, by the way. We can come back on this. And this is another aspect that I think we have to take into consideration in the past decade, is the growing, kind of fascistic atmosphere we're living in that is influencing as well the neoliberal authoritarian project. What do I mean by this? If you look at throughout the world, especially in the West, but not only, if you look at India, for the far-right and fascistic kind of movement, Israel is a model to follow. Why is it a model to follow? Because it is completely racist and outspoken about it in its policies, in its statements. Just to give you an example, within Palestine, for the Palestinians in 48, it is forbidden to use the term Nakba, catastrophe. Israeli ministers have been using on multiple occasions the term "we're doing a new Nakba." So clearly, saying complete ignoring completely international law, the securitization of the society, the way they treat the Palestinian is a dream for a lot of fascistic, hardcore right-wing political movement, and more neoliberal authoritarian parties. If you see the US, the way immigration is dealt, or Macron in France. So it's a model also to follow. So I think also there's the imperial aspect that we explain largely. And secondly, also the political environment on a worldwide basis we're living in. And I think it's something we shouldn't forget with the whole history of colonization, violence, the white supremacism. But this political environment, and this is why I was saying in introduction, the first question, I think we're living a crucial time of deep political crisis that is very dangerous for all of us. And we can see that what mentioned Sai as well is that when we're struggling for Palestine, we're also struggling, obviously, to save and to save the resistance against the genocide, but we're also struggling to save what is left of our democratic societies, because we can see that all the governments are attacking democratic rights and using the Palestinian cause to reinforce and strengthen their own authoritarianism. So, so I think I agree with what you said, Rosie, what Sai said, just adding these kind of aspects and the international political environment, I think that is key to understand.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful to map it out that way. I guess maybe it's also worth mapping something else out, which is, to touch on a similar point, but take it, I guess, back to a kind of basic level. As we've said time and again, it seems like there's no limit whatsoever, no depth of depravity, unwavering support of the US empire for Israel. People like John Mearsheimer talk about that in terms of the tail wagging the dog, right? In terms of Israel deciding what it's doing. That's clearly not what's going on, but why is it? Well, why? How do we explain that? How do you explain that there is nothing that they could do that would stop the US from supporting them? What is the US getting? Especially, given, whatever it was, 6th of October last year, them declaring peace in the Middle East, wanting to move towards foreign policy that focuses on China. Why then does this serve their interests?
I think it's maybe important to say, and I think Joe alluded to it at the very beginning of his first remark, which is that I think it's very difficult to extract this out of the kind of the global situation we are in. And the fact that this genocide, of course, takes place within a situation of regional reorganization and power struggles that I think we've named, but also in a global situation of crisis of hegemony. And that the kind of post-Cold War status quo, I think is, and I don't think necessarily the end of that status quo becomes clear only in the moment of genocide, although I think this is clearly a kind of an acceleration of that process, is that in a situation, we are at the end of a number of interconnected moments. We are at the end of a moment of unipolarity. The US is no longer the only, it's certainly still the most powerful by far. And I think that's being demonstrated on the backs of Palestinians and now Lebanese and Syrian and Yemeni and Iraqi and perhaps in the future Iranian civilians. So certainly still the most powerful, but no longer able to call the shots in a unilateral way. The second one is that inability is clearly leading American ruling classes to jettison the illusion, perhaps, of a rules-based order. Is that the rules work when they're not necessary, because American power isn't being challenged. Now that it's being challenged, I think we are being taught a collective global lesson of how the empire will act in a situation of being challenged. And I think it is saying to everybody that there is no bottom to the horror that it will rain down upon potential challenges. And that lesson, I think, is being sort of televised in this way, partly for that reason. And we mentioned some of the others. And then I think there's a number of interconnected crises, ecological, political, economic, that global capitalism doesn't really have an answer to. And that I think we are really in a global moment in which our ruling classes are absolutely choosing repression over consent, coercion over consent in how they will deal with that. And so when Joe talks about the fact that, of course, the kind of these political developments are also taking place in a context where, and I think neither of us are particularly interested in the debate about whether they're fascists or kind of like fascists or proto-fascists or neo-fascists or whatever, but fascist families are coming to power and are clearly choosing for repression as a way to stabilize the ruling class power. I think all of that together makes the moment of genocide possible. And so that it is about reestablishing control over the region in the way we've talked about. It's about furthering Israeli settler colonial power in Palestine in the way we've talked about. It's about trying to weaken and push back the axis of resistance in the region. But it is also, I think, about redrawing the rules of the game for the period ahead, and all of that I think means that on the one hand this is to the advantage of the United States, and I'm very unconvinced by. I mean, Marsheimer is actually having a renaissance. He's in again. Lots of people are sort of religiously following his podcast again and really kind of sharing his analysis. And I think there's something attractive about it, which would say that actually the rules-based order survives, but that what we're seeing is a blip. I'm not convinced that what we're seeing is a blip. I think that what we're seeing is a sign of the times to come in lots of different ways. And I think that's, bleak beyond words. And I think that's partly also related, and then I'll stop about this, the question of the temporality of it, which is that I think the logic early on, a year ago, was we mobilize now for a ceasefire. And this will be worse than previous attacks on Gaza. But this is the ballpark of what we're talking about. It might last a month or two, but at some point the United States will call the end of the operation and Israel will fall in line. And I think all of us have been forced to reckon with the fact that we're in a totally different temporality. And I'm not sure that we're necessarily coming out of this. So I'm not sure we're moving to a situation where Israel gets out of Gaza again. A situation where they settle part of it and where they continue an ongoing kind of process of war and elimination in the rest of Gaza, I don't think is is unimaginable. A situation where they maintain kind of ongoing military confrontations with Hezbollah in the south or the north, depending on from what perspective, is also totally imaginable, I think. And so I think this is a sign of the levels of violence and confrontation that of all these crises. And we already know that. We already know that the ecological crisis, the movements of populations and the way our states repress migrants, the growing repression of fascist or fascist-like governments across the world, etc., that we are in a much more violent historical period than we were a decade ago, let's say. But I think this is a sign of well, it's not a sign. It is a radical acceleration and deepening. Hence why you can have a year of non-stop and ever worsening genocide without anybody pulling the emergency brakes.
Yes, so I think that first of all, Mersheimer has always, his writings undermine our understanding of capitalist dynamics, wars, etc. One of his also famous books regarding the Israeli lobby is problematic in many ways, and unfortunately has been quite popular even among Palestine solidarity movement, and enable us to understand how U.S. imperial project consolidate. And since the 70s, it's been more and more clear that if the U.S. wants to to consolidate its hegemonic project, it needs allies, it needs gendarmes, it needs particular states. We also can see the multiplication of collaboration in the southeast of Asia because of challenging the rise of China, Ukraine, to create division in this geographical area. So unfortunately, again, Mersheimer is unable to understand, I believe, the relative weakening of U.S. imperial power, but as we said, that it's still the most important, and therefore is being even more violent in its action and reaction. But another thing I think important to consider is that we spoke about the settler colonial nature of Israel, and we are in an acceleration of a Nakba. Nakba is a continuous project, and the main objective, I believe, in the Gaza Strip is to destroy massively and to eliminate the Palestinians, to push them to leave and kill a maximum of them. But also a key issue, and this is where you see the main difference in the kind of political strategies regarding the West Bank, land grabbing to complete the Allen plan and an acceleration. This is happening without, key, not a lot of media's looking at it, unfortunately. Also, what's happening on West Bank, the violence, the expansion of settlements, obviously because there's an attention on the Gaza Strip and Lebanon. And finally, another dimension we haven't spoken of, and also the fact that it's very difficult to protest in the Middle East and North Africa. We've been in a period of defeats of revolutionary processes, of counter-revolutions that have been absolutely bloody. When we look at Syria, when we look at Egypt, when we look at Yemen, Iraq, etc., and in which the counter-revolutions and deeper economic crisis as well have provoked, a lot of fatigue, destructuration of opposition political movements, the ability to organize, the ability to build a counter-hegemonic project, and in which you have, obviously, and again, we have to be clear that the right of resistance is a principle that all leftists must support when it comes to Lebanon, Palestine, Iran, regardless of the nature of these actors. We can oppose their political project, but the right of resistance is a right of principle. But we cannot deny that the weaknesses of Iran, Hezbollah especially, is also due, in terms of popular support, I'm saying, to their own political orientation to their own political strategies. I mean, Hezbollah's is much more isolated politically and socially than in 2006, today in Lebanon, and even more widely in the region. I remember in 2006, you could see pictures of Hassan Nasrallah from Aleppo to Cairo. Well, you could see that his assassination didn't provoke the same kind of feeling. Why? Because Hezbollah has basically become an actor in Lebanon defending the neoliberal and sectarian regime while participating in consolidating the influence of Iran in the region, and especially in its role in Syria at the side of the Assad regime to crush the uprising. And this is why you understand the fact that Hezbollah is much more limited. Similarly, Iran's role in Iraq, Iran, to some extent Lebanon, is also problematic. And this is why also, if you want to build a wider project of resistance, it has to be rooted in the interest of the popular classes of the region. And this is also problematic for people, back in the Middle East, in North Africa. While, and I think to some extent there will be an article published soon on this, but the reactions in the Middle East to the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah, for me, the polarization about it's a reflection also of the weakness of an independent, democratic, and leftist bloc, able to oppose radically U.S. imperialism, Israel apartheid, colonial racist state, and its wars against the Palestinians and Lebanese, while at the same time, opposing authoritarian projects in the region that are also, creating destructions and elimination, even though not at the same level. We're not comparing, this is not the issue, but are creating destructions among local societies. So this is also something I think important to put forward. And obviously both have an interest, whether US imperialism and the allies in the region and authoritarian regimes as well, to prevent a political alternative.
Sai, do you want to add to that? Or I'm glad we've gotten on to a little bit about Hezbollah. I think we spent enough time maybe thinking about, what the US and Israel are up to, and maybe it's worth spending some time on the various resistance movements. So I think it's worth maybe thinking about, like, how do we understand, I think you've touched on some of it there, Joseph, but it's obviously complicated, right? These are pretty complicated formations. How do we, this is not a small question and we can take some time on it. How do we understand in political and also in strategic terms, Hamas on the one hand, Hezbollah on the other? What do they each stand for and represent? How are their interests similar? How are their interests different? How do we think about them, in this moment? Maybe you can start, Sai, and give Joe a little break.
Sure, although I feel like this is really Joe's question. Let me maybe say something about Hamas particularly. I don't feel like I can speak with enough authority about Hezbollah, and I'll leave that to Joseph. But look, I think there's a couple of things. I think on the one hand, it's important to always reiterate that the emergence of Hamas and the wider Islamic bloc around it, and so primarily Islamic Jihad, emerges out of the failures of its alternatives, and that it's impossible to understand it without understanding, on the one hand, the nature of the Israeli settler colonial regime and the way in which it defeated other political projects. And nowhere, I started by saying that I think in many ways this is a redrawing of the kind of political status quo and the sort of the end of whatever the structure of the Oslo years was, in terms of an occupation that was primarily, or not primarily, but an occupation that was also maintained by the development of a Palestinian Authority with its security apparatus that could both limit and repress forms of Palestinian resistance, political expression, organization, etc. And so that's the first thing I think to say, which is that Hamas becomes the dominant political expression of the Palestinian national movement in a period in which, on the one hand, the left is dramatically isolated, and where the nationalist factions, primarily Fatah, have taken the decision that they will become the managers of an extremely small series of Bantustan islands within the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And so that the popularity and the social support that Hamas receives and other organizations like it, primarily Islamic Jihad, comes out of the fact that they reject that status quo. They reject the Oslo agreements, or certainly they rejected originally that status quo, and demand the continuation of resistance against Israel. Certainly for Islamic Jihad, maintain the question of a unified future Palestinian state, which is a position that Hamas maintains for a while, until it develops a position where it is also prepared to say that it can live with a two-state solution, but a real one. And I think, again, that makes it really different from Fatah, is that it says we're prepared to move towards a negotiated settlement where we'll put our weapons down on the basis of a two-state solution, but it has to be a real one. So none of this, no control over our borders, no control over our diplomatic relations, no military, no freedom to decide our economic policy, etc., 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 but effectively become a labor pool for the Israeli market and an output for its exports, although exports is perhaps the wrong word. And so I think that fundamentally is the main question, is that these are organizations that refuse the capitulation of Fatah, and that continue in one form or another the idea of resistance. And so the landslide victory that Hamas wins in 2006 is that, and primarily that. And in fact, it's not only that election. Any election in students' unions, in trade unions, any places where there was the possibility of some level of democratic life inside of Palestinian civil society, that conclusion was drawn over and over and over again, is that these were the actors that had the credibility to say that as long as the colonial system is maintained, they will continue to resist. I think that's also partly the contradiction that Hamas found itself in, is that after the civil war, after its election in 2006, and the fact that Israel and the Western donor states throw their lot behind, after having pushed for the elections, by the way, throw their lot behind the loser so that Fatah can reclaim control, and in the end only over the West Bank. Hamas finds itself in a situation where it's trying to juggle both its ability to continue to maintain itself as a resistance organization and the reality of having to rule, which opens a whole number of contradictions. And again, I know Joe has written for Salvage about this, and he knows this much better than me, but you have the emergence of a new elite inside of Hamas, largely constituted around the tunnel economy and its relations, both with the Gulf states and with Turkey. And the emergence of much more complicated social relations. I think we saw them in the summer of 2023, for example, where real tensions actually developed internally inside of Gaza around questions of social justice and etc. And so I think, the 7th of October and the ability, which I think we also have to maintain, that whatever else there is to say, the ability of the most isolated, the most starved, the most repressed, the most attacked section of Palestinian society to break out of the camp in which it was held for 18 years was unimaginable, I think, for everybody. Unimaginable. It was an unimaginable moment, but it is both, I think, motivated by those internal contradictions and by the regional contradictions. I think it's both a decision by Hamas that it has no interest in ruling over a minuscule Bantustan being starved in the southwest of Palestine, in the isolation of being able to continue to maintain a political project that aims to the creation of a genuine Palestinian state. And I think in their vision at that time, a limited one. So that's one thing. The second one, I think, crucially, is the regional one. And you gestured towards it, Rosie. On the 22nd of September, I think it's 22nd, maybe the 21st of September 2023, Netanyahu is in the United Nations. He shows a map of the new Middle East in which Palestine is entirely disappeared, and in which the normalization deals run from Egypt to the UAE, with the possibility of developing the kind of infrastructure that Israel and the United States want to build across the Arabian Gulf, connecting the UAE to Israel in a kind of a corridor that will allow American imperialism to sidestep the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, and accelerate the kind of the movement of goods largely from India to Europe and in the other direction. And that Hamas makes the decision that both of those, breaking out of the contradictions that it is stuck in since 2006 inside of Gaza, and refusing to allow the Palestinian national question to disappear on the regional and global political scene, leads to the decision to carry out its operation. And I don't know that we have to rehearse some of those arguments. I think partly they're surprised by how far they're able to actually go on the day, and also surprised by how little support more wider regionally they receive. But all of that to say, I think that those realities aren't disappearing in whatever the tomorrow is when this ends, or when it enters a new phase. And I think, without wanting to tread on Joseph's toes too much, I think that's also true in Lebanon. And I think that's what I mean in terms of the fact that neither of these actors are disappearing. And I have trouble believing that Israeli policymakers don't know that. If we know it, I think they know it. Is that, if anything, I think they have solidified the fact that for a generation to come, Hamas and Islamic Jihad will be the main actors of the Palestinian national movement, by the ferocity and the horrors that they have unleashed on the Palestinians in Gaza, and the fact that these are the two only organizations that still stand between Palestinians and hell. And so that, I think, I think that contradiction, and the fact that those organizations will continue to maintain resistance in one form or another in whatever the kind of tomorrow is in Palestine, is a contradiction that Israel can't wish itself out of.
No, I totally agree with Sai. I would just add a few things on Hamas before passing over to Hezbollah. I think what is important also to take into consideration is that Hamas also has learned from the mistakes of the PLO. Basically, they're not going to fall in the same kind of traps. Basically, yes, for a two-state solution, but as Sai said, a real one, and therefore there will be no acknowledgement of the state of Israel until there's a clear path towards it. And this was one of the main mistakes of Fatah, more precisely, basically saying yes to the Oslo agreement, in which there was no kind of guarantees, just the fact that the PLO was recognized as the official representative of the Palestinian. Otherwise, the state issue, refugee issue, had to be tackled later on. I think there's also another thing to make maybe a difference between Hamas, because people most probably know that it has its roots with the Muslim Brotherhood and with other countries, is the limitation of its bourgeoisification of its cadres and leadership. This is the main difference, because of, even though there was the business of the tunnels, after 2013, following the military coup d'etat in Egypt, it was quite limited. And the ability to accumulate capital, or dynamics around capital accumulation in Palestine, is very much limited, whether in the West Bank or Gaza, because of the de-development, the siege policy, and that most of the big Palestinian bourgeois have made their money or accumulated capital outside of Palestine. They are mostly linked to the PA. This does not prevent, also some sections are being, bourgeois, but I think this is the main difference. And finally, also important to take into consideration today is that Hamas is perceived, I would say, and I'll come back to Gaza Strip, but outside of the Gaza Strip, as the main political actor leading the resistance. And it's not because, it's not its religious message or other thing. It's the fact that it is the main resistant actor. And we can see a rise of popularity of Hamas in the West Bank, but also in Palestinian refugee camps or population outside of Palestine. And for example, in Lebanon, where I think it's becoming their main basis outside of Palestine, and especially after they left Syria a while ago, etc. There's growing, people joining Hamas and also. So this is important, and I totally agree. They will not disappear. It's a mass political movement, and even though they're weakened militarily, politically, it will, I think, remain a key political party in the future of the Palestinian political national scene. I think, however, the Gaza Strip will be more different because there were already political criticism, and because of the destruction, the genocide issue will be much more difficult in the Gaza Strip for Hamas in the future. But this is another discussion. When it comes to Hezbollah, Hezbollah has been established on three main routes. First, it's an export of, if you want, the Islamic Revolution of Iran. It was a policy of the Islamic Republic of Iran to export its so-called Islamic Revolution to the Middle East, and its highest success is definitely Hezbollah until today. Second is definitely it's rooted in the resistance against Israel. This is clear that they played a key role in pushing out Israeli occupation in 2000 with the withdrawal of the Israeli occupation army of Lebanon. And finally, it's also the result of socioeconomic changes within the Shia community of Lebanon, with the rise of, particular, middle and let's say some bourgeois aspects within the Shia community in the end of the 60s, the beginning of the 70s, beginning with Harakat Amal, the other main Shia party, and also the changes within the socioeconomic structures of the Shia community. And until the 2000s, Hezbollah was mostly perceived as a resistant actor, not really involved into the politics, if you want, of Lebanon. They were present in the parliament, but from 2005, they entered the government following the withdrawal of the Syrian regime. And since then, and this is why they're partly considered as responsible for also the deep economic crisis in Lebanon since 2019, they participate in all the unity governments from 2005 to today, in which they had ministers, so participate in neoliberal policies, austerity measures. They had a class d'affaires, business networks expanding, especially after 2006, major investments following the reconstruction process after the Israeli war on Lebanon. They have huge networks of businessmen within the country and outside of the country. And therefore, Hezbollah, as I was saying before, has become the most important political actor in Lebanon. And this is why it has a high responsibility in the current situation. And the defender of the Lebanese sectarian neoliberal system. They opposed, for example, the Lebanese uprising in 2019. They even sent, their members to crush some protesters, whether in Beirut or in areas of the south of the east. This said, we have to be clear as well, just as Hamas, the decapitation of most of its political and military leadership does not mean the end of the political party or the movement. It has a mass following. It is facing the most challenging time since the foundation of the party, I believe so, since 82, but they have strong military capacities and have showed it by resistance against the ground offensive of the Israeli occupation army, targeting military sites in Haifa, Tel Aviv. And at the difference of many other Lebanese political parties, it is a structured and well-disciplined political party. It is not enough to kill if you want, to assassinate its leadership, to crush the movement. And finally, in a state of an absent state in Lebanon, or a state non-functioning is better, sorry. a state non-functioning, a deep economic crisis, and the lack of a political alternative, Hezbollah's popular base is not going to leave like this, the party. The major issue will be the post-war, the reconstruction process. Already, the number two, the Naim Qasim, Vice Secretary General of Hezbollah, has spoken about the fact that they will play a key role in reconstruction. So trying to give already guarantees to its popular base. But I think the main message is to say that we can be critical of these political parties or their political orientation, their limitation as well. When we spoke about Hamas, is also one of the issues of Hamas is depending on foreign actors to try to gain political achievement. We've seen the limitation of its coalition with Iran or Turkey that maintain, good relation with Israel under the table or above the table, where you want. But also, this is problematic in the case of. So we can be critical, but we need, especially as we are located in the West, and the role of our ruling class in helping, in participating in genocide, must be clearly to oppose our ruling class, defend the right of resistance of the Lebanese and Palestinian, which include these political parties, while having a critical perspective towards it and the limitation and being clear about it. I think also, because also if we want to be internationalists, we cannot deny the role of these political parties in the regional arena, and not only the limitation, but sometimes, especially when it comes to Hezbollah, it's very negative role in Syria or Lebanon or elsewhere.
Thank you so much, both of you. We have about 15 minutes left, and we have some questions coming in from the audience. They're all actually kind of around the same theme, which is, what can we do about it? So one question is, what will it take to stop Israel? Is there any way to halt the genocide? The second one is, Palestinians will not be exiting this temporality of domination soon, in spite of the uprising. So how can those who resist their erasure persist without a conceivable future of liberation? And then the third one is, in terms of the depth of terror that imperial powers are willing to wreak when challenged, why do you think it's the case that appeals to morality and mercy don't work to oppose colonialism? And I just want to caveat here, Sai and I have had some conversations about the difficulty of answering these questions at this moment, where you feel a political responsibility to offer hope when most of us aren't feeling a lot of hope right now. We're watching people being burned alive in their beds and murdered day in, day out. We wake up to images more horrifying than the day before every day for a year. And as I said, we expected horror, but not perhaps not for as long as it's gone on. So I do want to kind of encourage you to try and walk that line. We all bear that responsibility. It's our job to uplift each other and to keep each other going. And, the Palestinians need us to continue in steadfastness. But I think it's also worth being honest about, not feeling hopeful, and being honest about what kind of strategy and what kind of timeline we're really talking about when we talk about liberating Palestine. So I don't know who wants to start on that, but maybe Sai?
Sure. Just, a couple of things I think also on that is that, I think we have to be honest, which is that we haven't stopped the genocide. And one of the reasons I'm a little bit nervous about a lot of the sort of the think pieces that have circulated around the fact that this is the beginning of the end of Zionism, etc., is the idea that, and I don't mean it as a sort of an empty slogan, but that power concedes nothing without demand and without counterpower. And that, the kind of the question on morality and mercy and in opposing colonialism, being a student of colonial regimes, they are only ended. They are only destroyed. They don't just end. There's this, the beautiful way in which Fanon talks about colonialism as not being a thinking machine. It is just violence. That is what it is. It is a global strategy of accumulation that can only be maintained through extraordinary amounts of violence expanded on a global scale. And that is what imperialism is. It's extreme amounts of violence that make the extraction and circulation of capital possible on a global stage, and with all the inequalities and the consequences that it has. And so it needs to be destroyed if it is to end. And I think we've had a terrible illustration of our weakness, is that the highest level of mobilization that our side has ever been able to mobilize on a global level has not been nearly enough to force our governments to break their relations with Israel, and certainly not on forcing the United States primarily to force Israel to end either the genocide or the assaults across the region. And so so that's the kind of the honest lesson I think that we have to draw. And I think there's a question of temporality. And to me, one of the things that the genocide has also been, alongside all the things that we've mentioned and that you just talked about in terms of the unspeakable levels of horror that Palestinians are living through, is a spotlight on our collective weaknesses. And I think in lots of ways. So we've already talked about regional weaknesses, the fact that we are not in a situation like 2011 or 2019 where, and there was a brief moment early on where we thought perhaps we would be, mass mobilizations in Jordan and Iraq, what appeared to be the return of street politics and popular mobilizations in Egypt. But we are not in a situation where the masses of the region are challenging their regimes, and by challenging their regimes, challenging the stability of the imperial status quo in the region. And that, I think, remains the key question for the liberation of Palestine and the transformation of the regional power balances. And you know, we probably don't have the time, but that's the kind of the long decade of repression across the region that was just as demonstrative in different ways, and not genocidal, but just as demonstrative, demonstrating to the masses of the region through the extraordinary amount of repression and violence we saw in Egypt, in Yemen, in Syria, in Sudan, in Libya, etc., both by regional ruling classes and by global imperialist powers, was also a lesson, an abject lesson in repression and kind of teaching a lesson to those who would fight back. And I think we are still in that moment. And again, the article by Nihal that I mentioned earlier, I think there's a really important job in kind of bringing these arguments together again in the current moment. And maybe John can share it in the chat for people to read. But so that, I think, is one aspect. The other aspect is that it's very much a spotlight for ourselves. I live in the Netherlands for the moment. I live in Rotterdam, the city with the largest port in Europe, which I think was always, for example, for us, a key question of would we be able to join in the Netherlands, the kind of global wave of actions in ports that stopped the circulation of weaponry and of Israeli goods. We weren't. Now that shines a light on the weakness of our labor movement. It shines a light on the weakness of our ability to self-organize. It shines a light on the balance of forces in the Netherlands that is absolutely not in the advantage of labor, social movements, or progressive forces. And I think similar lessons can be drawn in different places, that it has shown us the levers we were able to pull, and it has certainly shown us the levers we weren't able to pull. And I think largely that revolves around the question of the inability to turn industrial power on a mass scale into action around a widely felt political issues. I think, you know, the majority of workers in a place like Britain, many in other places, I don't know if they're majorities, but very large amounts of workers will have been on the demonstrations, will have signed petitions, will have felt that this horror needed to end. They didn't feel able to mobilize those political demands in their workplaces. and turn those political demands into industrial power, or to mobilize their industrial power to make those political demands a reality. I think that's a sign of all our weaknesses. And so that also, I think, is then the question in terms of how we think in a different temporality. We have not stopped the genocide, and we shouldn't stop disrupting and talking and publishing and mobilizing and not letting our rulers getting away with doing this quietly. I'm not at all talking about us retreating or disappearing from the political stage, but I think we are also called on to start thinking about what all these weaknesses mean for our long-term strategies. And something I've said a lot in different formats is that we often talk about solidarity not being charity. And I think the tool of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement is exactly that. On the one hand, it is absolutely necessary if we are to weaken the Israeli state, if we are to weaken our own state's imperial policies in the Middle East, and if we are to lift the boot on the neck of the Palestinians somewhat to allow their political movements and their resistance to be more effective. But it is not only that, it is also a political tool for all of us to fight for the democratization of our communities, of our workplaces, of our governments, of our relation with our own states, etc., in the ways that we've talked about, the massive gap that has existed between public sentiment across our states and how our politicians have acted in relation to the genocide. And so that, I think, is the sort of torch that the Palestinian National Movement has given us and has called upon us to act on, which is to say that our fight for solidarity with the Palestinians is also a fight for the fundamental reorganization and democratization of our own states, of our own institutions, of our own workplace. And it's not for nothing that the Palestine solidarity movement is being attacked so violently, because it touches on the heart of imperialism, of global networks of accumulation, and on this question of democratic control over our own lives, that I think we have to maintain through all the demoralization, all of the defeat, all of the horror. We have to maintain this question that we are fighting for a different world. We are doing so globally and locally in conditions that are not favorable to our side. But the only way that we will change that is by continuing the drive to organize and to resist. And unfortunately, the historical cards we have been dealt are very bleak and difficult ones. But one does not choose the conditions within which one fights. So I'm going to forget the name now. Pablo Casals. Is it Pablo Casals? I hope it's Pablo Casals. A Latin American Marxist famously said, the situation is hopeless. We have to take the next step. And so I think that's where we are.
Well, I totally agree with what Sai said, and I've been arguing a similar orientation. And basically, I would say that there's no alternative for us to organize, to structure ourselves in terms of movements, organization, pressure from below. And there's obviously a feeling among a lot of us and in the wider movement of defeatism, not able to stop the genocide, the expansion of the war in Lebanon, the expansion of attacks of Israel on the wider Middle East. But at the same time, this feeling of defeatism we have to build on, and there's accumulation of also political experiences. People have accumulated experiences in these different social movements that we've seen throughout the world. And I agree with Sai, the level of repression is also because out of the fear of what these movements can give, people from various political backgrounds have did experiences together, whether ecological, anti-racist, various brands of leftism, people that were not necessarily into politics, and all these people meeting around the Palestinian issue and thinking about, another kind of society is a threat for our ruling classes, and therefore the repression. And it's really important to say that nothing has been given, if we want, to the popular classes throughout history without movement from below, without pressure from below when it comes to democratic rights of the workers, when it comes to women's rights, when it comes to everything. This is why also we shouldn't have a deterministic view of history when we see the catastrophe upon us, the genocide, but also the attacks on women's right of abortion in the US. This means we always have to fight for our rights, and nothing will be given to us. And in this perspective, again, this is how I usually put it in terms of war. We need to make the case that our destinies are linked, meaning that solidarity is definitely not charity, that a victory in Palestine is a victory for us, because it's a challenge to our own ruling class. And more, I believe that some of the people are seeing their link, these kind of links. They're seeing how Palestine is linked to feminist issues, how it's linked to capitalist issues, to ecological issues. And these are already, and obviously it's not to undermine the difficult situation we're living, but these kind of links are very interesting, I think, for the alternative we want to build, alternative to capitalism, socialism from below. And therefore, I think, again, to understand the Palestinian issue as international solidarity, absolutely necessary to stop a genocide in front of us, but also as a way to save us as well, to save us from the political projects of our ruling classes, the rise of fascistic movements, etc. So, and again, I don't think we can appeal to morality. Its roots, everything is unmoral when it comes to colonization, imperialism, etc. But it's about changing the balances of forces in our own society. This means organizing, and we have no alternative to this. I think another argument to say, to bring back in our movement as well, is the issue how Palestine is linked to the regional uprisings and international solidarity. Palestinians, since the rise of the Zionist movement and after the establishment of Israel, have never only struggled against the Zionist movement or Israel. They have struggled against the whole world. And therefore, this is how we understand that it's an absolute necessity to see the Palestinian issue into a regional internationalist issue. We talked about the way Israel was provided weapons that otherwise it would have been unable to the Israeli state to pursue the genocide expansion of the world. But also to put forward that the vast majority of authoritarian regimes in the region see today what is happening as a threat to their own power, not because of the genocide, but because of the threat of their own protest movement and their own countries. And you can see this in Jordan. They're repressing any kind of movement that is going towards the Israeli embassy or towards the Palestinian occupied territories. You can see this with the political behavior of Egypt, the Gulf regime. We should remind that Egypt is the second recipient of U.S. military assistance, financial assistance in the world, and that at the beginning of the revolutionary processes in 2011, for the first time in decades, you had connected marches of return from Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt. And actually, for once, I agreed with the foreign minister of Israel, Leibovitz, at the time. I think he said the biggest threat for Israel is a democratic Egypt. He understood very well that democratized societies in the Middle East and North Africa is a threat to Israel, and therefore a threat to the imperial Western imperial framework. So it's important also to, and obviously because of the defeats, of the level of the defeats, the ability to believe the change from below, from mass participation, has been undermined. While it came back in 2011, and it has, again, the regional uprising did not stay in the region. It had international consequences when we look at the Occupy movement, movement of Podemos, and therefore, again, argue that movement from below, the interests of the Palestinian and the regional and international working class is one destiny in the meaning that they have common interest, does not mean that we're living in the same condition, not at all. But victories of one is victories for all of us. So bringing back this idea, of the collection, the regional uprising, the international solidarity, in our struggle, and to make yes, this kind of argument forward, to understand that our solidarity is not about charity. Our solidarity is about the way we feel that our destinies are linked if we want a better future.
Thank you, both of you. We are a little over time, so I think we'll have to leave it there. I have many more questions that I could have asked, and I think there's many more things we could have talked about, so perhaps we'll have to do a part 2 at some point. But I just want to thank you both for making the time. It's been really great to talk to you and to hear. And thanks for everyone who's watching for joining us. May we live to see a free Palestine.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much.